welcome one and all once again to Sunday School here at Upper Room Ministries. So glad you've joined us today here at the Days Inn on Route 30 in York, Pennsylvania, and on the White Rose Network, Channel 16, as well as the Bright Star Network in Pakistan. We are continuing our series on Bible prophecies that have come to pass or will come to pass. And just so everybody knows, this entire series will be made available on DVD. So if you miss an episode, don't worry about it. You'll be able to get a copy of it later on. All right. We last left off with prophecy number 775. So now we shall begin in the book of Judges, starting in chapter 6. Please turn there. Now, throughout the book of Judges, there is a reoccurring theme. Whenever Israel would fall into sin and rebellion, the Lord would always hand it over to its enemies. And they would remain there until they repented and cried out to God, from which the Lord God would deliver them from their enemies. Sadly, this happened multiple times throughout the generations. They just never quite learned their lesson. The latest, in chapter 6, starting in verse 1, says, "And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of Midian." 7 years. Yes. During this time, the Midianites forced the Israelites to actually flee into mountains and caves. And they also took control of sheep, ox, donkeys, whatever they could get their hands on. And finally, Israel cried out to God for help, and so God chose a leader to lead an army against Midian, and the man he chose was named Gideon. Okay, then we go to verse 12. It says, "And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him, and said unto him, The Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor." And Gideon does not respond with any kind of awe or any kind of humility. Instead, Gideon responds with questions. He says, "If the Lord is really with us, then why has all this befallen us? Where are the miracles that his father told us, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites." Well, this right here shows ignorance on Gideon's part, because the Lord made it very clear in the Torah what would happen if Israel rebelled against God. He should have realized Israel was in a state of rebellion, and that's why God did this. But then in verse 14, it says, "And the Lord looked upon him and said, Go in this thy might, and thou shalt save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have I not sent thee?" All right, that's prophecies number 776. And then we scoot down to verse 16. "And the Lord said unto him, Surely I will be with thee, and thou shalt smite the Midianites as one man." Those are prophecies number 777 and 778. All of this would come to pass later on when he would lead his army of 300 against the entire Midianite army. Okay. Now, all right, in chapter 7, Gideon has assembled an army of Israelites of 32,000, But God tells Gideon that's too many, because if this many men went up against the Midianite army, the people of Israel, as well as the surrounding nations, will believe that Israel did it all themselves and needed no help from God. So God told Gideon to trim the army down. So Gideon said to the army, "If there is anyone here who is too afraid to attack the Midianite army, leave now and go home." And 22,000 left. 22,000 cowards, I must say. And God has no use for cowards in his army. So now they're left with 10,000. But God replied to Gideon, "No, that's still too many." And so a second test was applied. The 10,000 men were told to go get a drink of water. And of the 10,000, 9,700 of them laid down on their stomachs and put their faces in the water, lapping it up, as the Bible says, like dogs. And dogs are the lowest of the low amongst the Jewish population. So that right there is an insult. Whereas 300 of them got down on their knees, put their hands in the water, and held them up to their face. And they couldn't drink as much water as they would have if they were on their face in the water. But what this does is it allows them to drink while constantly looking around for the enemies. If you're lying on your stomach with your face in the water, you can't see any enemies coming. So from that, the 300 who cupped their hands into the water and drank, they were the ones chosen. It's really notable how these 300 men were selected. They were the best of the best. They were both brave and they were both alert. They were battle-minded. So these weren't just 300 random men. They had qualities to them. That's very important to remember. Okay, now, chapter 7, verse 7 says, "And the Lord said unto Gideon, By the 300 men that lapped will I save you, and deliver the Midianites into thine hand." Which of course happened. That's prophecy 779. Okay. And then we scoot down to verses 9, 10, and 11. And there are three predictions by Gideon, three predictions to Gideon that would come to pass. One in verse 9. I, God, have delivered the host of the Midianites into your hand. And then in verse 11, God says, "You will hear what they say, and after this you will be strengthened with a boldness to go down to the host." All right. Those are prophecies 780 through 782. Okay. Then we go over to verses 13 through 15. And Gideon overhears one man telling another man of a dream that he had, starting in verse 13. I'll read it to you. It said, "And when Gideon was come, behold, there was a man that told a dream unto his fellow, and said, Behold, I dreamed a dream, and lo, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the host of Midian, and came unto a tent, and smote that it fell, and overturned it, and the tent lay alone." So basically what he's saying, this large cake of barley, large loaf of barley bread, had rolled into Midian and knocked down a tent and overturned it. So what is the interpretation of this? It says so in verse 14, "And this fellow answered and said, This is nothing else save the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel, for into his hand hath God delivered Midian and all the host." This was like a final confirmation for Gideon that God was going to deliver the army into his hands. As I'm sure we're all familiar with the story of Gideon, he throws out the fleece onto the evening ground, and God said, if you're really going to be with me, please make the fleece wet, but the ground dry, which God did. And then he did the same test again, only this time it said, make the ground wet and the fleece dry, which God did. So God is pretty much giving him a final confirmation before Gideon asks for it. All right? That's prophecy 783. Anyway, all of it comes to pass. In verses 16 all the way through 25. Okay, now we move on to chapter 8. And in chapter 8, we have the aftermath of the battle. The battle's been won. And now Gideon is returning home, and he's looking to feed his men. And yes, and at the same time, he's pursuing two men, two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna. Yes, and starting in verse 4, it says, Gideon came to Jordan and passed over, he and the 300 men that were with him, faint yet pursuing them being Zebah and Zalmunna. And he said unto the men of Succoth, Give, I pray you, loaves of bread unto the people that follow me, for they be faint, and I am pursuing after Zebah and Zalmunna, kings of Midian. And the princes of Succoth said, Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in thine hand, that we should give bread unto thine army? So basically, the men of Succoth are saying, you go get those kings first, then we'll feed you. And Gideon's response was, in verse 7, Therefore, when the Lord hath delivered Zebah and Zalmunna into mine hand, then I will tear your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and briars. And that would come to pass in verse 16. Those are prophecies 784 and 785. Zebah and Zalmunna were delivered into the hands of Gideon, and he made true on his word. He came back to the city of Succoth and tore them apart tore their flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with the briars. Like I said, that's verse 16. Okay, and then in verse 8, he says, And he went up thence to Peniel, and spake unto them likewise, and the men of Peniel answered him as the men of Succoth had answered him. And so Gideon gives them a similar response. In verse 9, he said, He spake also unto the men of Peniel, saying, When I come again in peace, I will break down this tower. And that would be fulfilled in verse 17, where it says, And he beat down the tower of Peniel, and slew the men of the city. Okay. Now, moving on further in chapter 8, the Israelites are just astounded by Gideon's victories in battle, and they're asking Gideon to please become their king, and his son and also saying that his son and his grandson will also be kings of Israel, but Gideon refuses to do so. Okay. Which then brings us to chapter 9. It says, which brings us to Abimelech. He decides to go into business for himself and become king of a city called Shechem. It says, starting in chapter 9, verse 1, And Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal, went to Shechem unto his mother's brethren, and communed with them, with all the family of the house of his mother's fathers, saying, he says, Speak, I pray to you, in the ears of all men of Shechem, whether it is better for you, either that all the sons of Jerubbaal, which is another name for Gideon, just so you know, which are 70 persons, that's 70, reign over you, or that one reign over you, remember also I am your bone and your flesh. So Abimelech, one of Gideon's many sons, he had a number of wives and concubines. You know, he goes to Shechem, where his mother's brothers, his uncles, are living, and he's just saying, you know, would you rather have 70 kings ruling over you or just one? And by using his influence and his family's influence in the city of Shechem, he received from them 70 pieces of silver out of the house of Baal-Berith, where Abimelech hired vain and light persons which followed him. And he hired a bunch of soldiers to hunt down the other 70 sons of Gideon and had them slain, so that he would be the only ruler. I'm guessing that because the Israelites loved Gideon so much, they would want to give one of his descendants, you know, a monarchy, a kingship, and he decided, I'm going to eliminate all competition. So he did so by slaying all of Gideon's sons. However, there was one that escaped, the youngest. His name was Jotham. And let's go to verse 7. Okay. It said, when they told it to Jotham, it being Abimelech being made king of Shechem, it says, he went and stood up on the top of the mountain of Gerizim, and lifted up his voice and cried and said unto them, Hearken unto me, ye men of Shechem, that God may hearken unto you. And in the next, in verses 18 through 15, he proceeds to tell them a parable. He talks about, he compares the Israelites asking all these people to be their king, and them constantly being refused. In verse 9, it says, the trees, the Israelites, went forth on a time to anoint them a king over them, and they said unto the olive tree, reign over us. But the olive tree said unto them, should I leave my fatness, wherewith by me they honor God and man, and go be promoted over the trees? Okay. And verse 10, they ask a fig tree. The fig tree gives them a similar response. Verse 12, they ask a vine, the same thing, but the vine once again gives them a similar response. And then in verse 14 it says, they said, all the trees unto the bramble, they're asking a bramble bush, come and reign over us. And the bramble said unto the trees, if in truth ye anoint me king over you, then come and put my trust in my shadow, and if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon. That of course is Abimelech. You know, he is the bramble bush. And what's being foretold here is, says, if you do put my trust in my shadow, fine. And if not, I shall destroy. I the bramble will have fire come out of me and devour the cedars of Lebanon. Now, Jotham further goes on to explain that the people of Shechem had slain the sons of Gideon, and he says to them, you know, if by your actions you have honored my father, then great. It says in verse 19, it says, if ye then have dealt truly and sincerely with Jerubbaal, Gideon, and with his house this day, then rejoice in Abimelech, and let him also rejoice in you. He's saying, if your actions did indeed honor my father, then rejoice, as with Abimelech. But in verse 20 it says, but if not, let fire come out of Abimelech, and devour the men of Shechem, and the house of Milo, and let fire come out from the men of Shechem and from the house of Milo, and devour Abimelech. Those are two prophecies, 787 and 788. And this would come to pass from verses 22 all the way through 56. Verses 22 and 23, it says, when Abimelech had reigned 3 years over Israel, then God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the men of Shechem, and the men of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech. Yes, God allowed strife to occur between Abimelech and the men of Shechem. The men of Shechem rebelled against him, and basically what happens is Abimelech assembles an army, and they fight against the men of Shechem, and they wipe out many men of Shechem. But in the end, Abimelech also gets wiped out when he's storming a tower. This is starting in verse 54. He's storming a tower, and then an unnamed woman drops a millstone right upon his head from a window of the tower, and he tells his armor bearer to please kill him so he'll not suffer the disgrace of being killed by a woman. And in verse 56 and verse 57 says, thus God rendered the wickedness of Abimelech, which he did unto his father in slaying his 70 brethren, and all the evil of the men of Shechem did God render upon their heads, and upon them came the curse of Jotham, son of Jerubbaal. Yes, in God's eyes, the men of Shechem did evil by appointing Abimelech, a mass murderer, as their king. And God delivered justice unto both Abimelech and the men of Shechem, exactly how Jotham prophesied earlier, 3 years earlier. Okay, we then move on to chapter 13. Please turn in. Okay. Chapter 13, starting in verse 1. It says, and the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines 40 years. All right. And there was a certain man of Zorah, of the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and bare not. Okay. Then, verses 3 through 5, there are 3 prophecies. Verse 3, an angel of the Lord appeared unto the woman and told her that you shall conceive and bear a son, which she did. And going down to verse 5, the angel says, he, her son, shall begin to deliver Israel from the hand of the Philistines, and he shall be a Nazarite from his mother's womb. Okay. This, of course, these of course are prophecies about Samson, and all 3 of them would come to pass. And he did indeed deliver Israel from the hand of the Philistines. He would single-handedly slay 1,000 with the jawbone of a donkey, because he had supernatural strength rendered unto him by God. Of course, we all know the story of Samson and Delilah. He allowed himself to be seduced by Delilah. Delilah asked, what's the secret of the strength? And eventually he would said, my hair is cut, a razor to the head, I will lose my strength. She cut his hair off, he lost his strength. But he would eventually crush many Philistines in one final plea to the Lord, when he pushed aside pillars and caused the roof of one of their giant buildings to crash upon them. And that right there is another example of redemption. Samson cries out, for God to please give him one final act of redemption, and God granted it to him. I mean, yes, it was an act of suicide, but God still granted it to him. All right. We then go to chapter 19. Oh, wait a minute. Yes, chapter 19. Okay. All right. And now in this, now here we have a Levite man who marries a concubine, and who later on becomes a harlot, and then retreats to her father's house, in Bethlehem. The Levite eventually goes to the house of the concubine's father, and wants to bring her home back to Ephraim, where they reside, I should say. They stay for a number of days. The father wants them to stay longer. He keeps coming up with reasons for them to stay, but eventually the Levite says, no, we must be going. And so he, his concubine, and a servant set out for Ephraim, and they're traveling, and it's getting late, and the servant said, let's stay in Jerusalem. The only problem is Jerusalem at this time was dominated by the Jebusites, and the Levite didn't want to spend the night in a city full of strangers, as he called them. So he eventually went to a city called Gibeah, which is found in the land of Benjamin. This decision to go to Gibeah would have catastrophic consequences. He and his concubine found themselves in the town square, in need of a place to stay. Now either this means there was no inn for them to stay, or there was an inn, but the rooms were all taken. But in any case, they needed someone to be hospitable to them and take them in. Well, there was an old man who was from Ephraim, but was staying in Gibeah at the time. He saw them, and he asked them what they were doing out there. They said, we need a place to stay. So the old man said, well, I'll let you stay. I'll let you stay at my house. So he brought them in, and from what the Bible says, they were having a good time. When all of a sudden, some evil, perverted men of Gibeah go to the old man's house, and they demand that they send out the man they have. They demand they send out the Levite so they can have sex with him. And the old man says, I will not allow you to do such a wicked thing. But then he says, but then what he does is he throws out the Levite's concubine to them and says, do whatever you want with them, and shuts the door. These men of Gibeah did indeed have their way with her, as they repeatedly raped her and beat her all throughout the night until the sun came up. They left her for dead at the door of the old man. The Levite would then come out. Apparently he was oblivious to what happened to his concubine. He opens the door, and he sees his concubine just laying there. You know, he tries to poke her, but she's not moving, she's dead. And his response is to put her body on his donkey and carry her the rest of the way home to Ephraim. To which then he cuts up his concubine into 12 pieces and sends a piece to each of the tribes of Israel, which gives you an idea of how little he actually cared about his concubine. Okay, then we move on to chapter 20. At this point, there is a mobilization going on, and a very large congregation of Israeli leaders have gathered in Mitzvah. and the Levite is there, and he is asked to please tell everyone what had happened, and he proceeds and does so, and the men and these Israelites, they're furious, and they're saying justice must be done. So word was sent to the Benjaminites to find the wicked men of Geba and deliver the men to them so they can be killed. And for whatever reason, the men of the Benjaminites refused to do so, and instead assembled an army of 26,000 men to defend the city. Well, this Israelite coalition came at them with an army of 400,000. It should have been an easy victory, considering how this Israel coalition far outnumbered the army of Benjamin. But wouldn't you know it, the first time the Israelites attack, the Benjaminites hold them off, slaughtering 22,000 of the army of Israel. They come back another day, try again, and the Benjaminites once again hold them off, killing 18,000 more of the Israelite army. So, we then come to verse 26 of chapter 20, where it says, "Then all the children of Israel and all the people went up and came unto the house of God and wept, and sat there before the Lord and fasted that day until even, and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And the children of Israel inquired of the Lord, for the ark of the covenant of God was there in those days. And Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, stood before it in those days, saying, Shall I yet again go out to battle against the children of Benjamin, my brother, or shall I cease? And the Lord said, Go up, for tomorrow I will deliver them into thine hand." That's prophecy number 792. I'm guessing this is the very first time they actually sought the Lord in whether to attack or not, because clearly the Lord's favor wasn't on them until the third time they attempted this. And as the Lord said, the army of Benjamin was delivered up to the Israelites, and the city of Gibeah was taken. We see the fulfillment starting in verse 35. It says, "And the Lord smote Benjamin before Israel, and the children of Israel destroyed of the Benjaminites that day 25,100 men. All these drew the sword. So the children of Benjamin saw that they were smitten, for the men of Israel gave place to the Benjaminites, because they trusted unto the liers in wait, which they had set beside Gibeah. And the liers in wait hastened and rushed upon Gibeah, and the liers in wait drew themselves along and smote all the city with the edge of the sword." Yes, the entire city was wiped out. Not just the perverted men, but everybody. It's an example how the sin of a few can have an impact on many more people. Yes, that's just the kind of impact sin has, and that's how severe God will go, how severe God is in exterminating it. Yes, and let's fast forward to verses 47 and 48. It says, "But 600 men of Benjamin, turned and fled to the wilderness unto the rock Rimmon, and abode in the rock Rimmon 4 months. And the men of Israel turned again upon the children of Benjamin, and smote them with the edge of the sword, as well the men of every city as the beast, and all that came to hand. And they also set fire all the cities they came to." So, wow, it's not just Gibeah that they destroyed, but all of the cities they came across in the land of Benjamin. I mean, this is just, I don't know how to describe that. I mean, this was just a thorough cleansing of the tribe of Benjamin. Not just for what happened in Gibeah, but also the Benjaminites' choice to rebel against the other 11 nations, and not just simply hand over to the men of Israel. Had they done that, this most certainly would not have happened. Then moving on to chapter 21, the other 11 tribes began to have remorse for how the tribe of Benjamin had just been about nearly wiped out. And so they did what they could to help restore the tribe, even supplying virgins for the remaining 600 men who fled. Okay. The last verse of Judges 21, verse 25, says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes." So by this point, I believe the writer is trying to convey that, without a human ruler as king to dictate the laws, everybody just did what they wanted in their own eyes. They did what was right in their own eyes. I mean, that's just how it is. We seem to have, we as humans seem to have more respect and more honor for a human ruler as opposed to God himself, simply because we can see a human. Yes. Because we can't see God, quite often we just think, well, God's not really paying attention. I can't see God, so he can't see me, that sort of thing. And it's just this state of mentality where every man did that which was right in his own eyes, that the demand for a king truly came forth, which will come forth in the book of 1 Samuel. Okay, that concludes the book of Judges, which brings us to the book of Ruth. There are no prophecies in the book of Ruth. However, there is some foreshadowing that I think is important to mention in the book of Ruth. Let us first turn to verse 16 of chapter 1. Those who are familiar with the story of Ruth, Naomi, and Orpah. And Orpah and Ruth are the daughter-in-laws of Naomi. Naomi, Jewish woman who had 2 sons who married 2 Moabites, 2 Gentile women. Naomi's husband and her 2 sons died, so she heads back. She starts to head back to Israel, and then she tells her 2 Moabite daughters-in-law to go and leave her, go back to your people. Orpah gives her a kiss and leaves, but Ruth stays behind and clings. And in verse 16, I like to read the last portion of the verse. It says, Ruth says to Naomi, "Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." So, what this shows is a Gentile woman forsaking not only her people, but also her beliefs, her gods, and expressing a desire to become as of the nation of Israel and to worship the God of Israel. And this is how God wanted to use the nation of Israel. He wanted to set Israel apart and make the Gentile nations realize that their God is the true God, so that the Gentile nations will renounce their pagan ways and fall in submission to the God of Israel. Now, I should point out that those aren't exactly the reasons why Ruth did it. She did it simply out of loyalty to Naomi, but regardless of her motivations and her intentions, she still did it. And therefore, well, as we all know, she would marry Boaz, and move to chapter 4, verse 17. Ruth and Boaz, they marry, and they give birth to a child, and his name is called Obed, and he is the father of Jesse and the father of David. Now, as we all know, the Messiah would come through David's lineage. That means that in the bloodlines of the Messiah is Gentile blood. Which I believe is a foreshadowing of God's desire to redeem not only the Jews but also the Gentile nation, which of course we would see play out in the New Testament. All right, that concludes Ruth. So now we move on to 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel, chapter 1. There was a man named Elkanah, and he has 2 wives, Peninnah and Hannah. Peninnah bore Elkanah children, but Hannah had no children. The reason being, in verse 5, because the Lord had shut up her womb. Now, I'd like to point out, usually, in this culture, if a woman can't give birth to children, she's looked down upon. But in verse 8, it says, Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Why do you weep over not having children? Why is your heart grieved? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? I mean, Elkanah is telling Hannah, it's okay, that you haven't born children. I'm not rejecting you. And that, to me, is just amazing. That Hannah's husband would show her that much compassion and that much care for her. But Hannah, she wanted to have children, so much so that she made a vow that if God would give her a son, she would then give her son back to God to be used by Him in whatever way God wanted. And that's just amazing, Hannah knew that the only way she could have a child is by God's favor upon her. And she said, so great will my gratitude be, I'll give him right back to you to be used by you. She was willing to give up her own child, for God's sake. And that shows love. And that shows a genuine willingness to give up even your own precious possessions for God's sake. That's certainly an example that we all need to follow. A willingness to give up even our own flesh and blood, if God wants them. Well, as we all know, the Lord God would open up Hannah's womb. She would conceive and give birth to Samuel. And as she promised, she gave Samuel back to God. Samuel would grow up amongst the priests and learn how to become a priest. We then move on to chapter 2. And chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, Hannah offers up a prayer. And in this prayer, there are 10 prophecies. So these are prophecies 793 through 802. I pull them up. Okay. The prophecies actually begin in verse 5. And in verse 5, she talks about how she herself will become fruitful. And she did. She would go on to have 3 more sons and 2 daughters after Samuel. And verse 6, she says, God will bring up men from hell. I believe that's a reference to the final judgment mentioned in Revelation, where death and hell gave up their dead, and then death and hell were thrown into the lake of fire. Then in verse 8, Hannah talks about the exaltation of the poor and even beggars to sit among princes and inherit the throne of glory, referring to the converted becoming kings and priests for all eternity, also mentioned in Revelation. Number 4, God is to keep the feet of his saints. That's mentioned in verse 9. And then the fifth one, the wicked shall remain in silent darkness of eternal death in hell. Yes, when talking about hell, God doesn't just talk about fire, he talks about darkness. I believe in 2 Peter, he talks about the blackest darkness being reserved for false teachers. And there was also a parable Jesus told about a man who showed up at a wedding party without his wedding clothes. So he was so this man was tied up and thrown into the darkness. So this is a foreshadowing of the darkness that will be talked about in the New Testament. 6 through 10 are all found in verse 10. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken into pieces. That will take place at the second coming of Christ. 7, out of heaven shall the Lord thunder upon his enemies. That's in Revelation chapter 19. 8, the Lord shall judge the ends of the earth. That's in Matthew 25. Number 9, he shall give strength to his king. Yes, the Messiah will be called a king. Revelation chapter 19. And lastly, he shall exalt the horn of his anointed. Revelation chapters 1, chapters 11, and chapters 20. That's what that's covered. Now, what's significant about Hannah talking about the king is that this is the second time the Messiah is referred to as a king. The first time was by Balaam in Numbers chapter 24, verse 7. Okay. Now, Samuel grows up under the mentorship of Eli, and starting in verse 12, the writer of Samuel begins to outline what God has against Eli. It all has to do with his sons. In verse 12, it says, these aren't prophecies, by the way. Verse 12, it says they were the sons of Belial, which means they chose to serve the devil. Also in verse 12, it says they knew not the Lord. That means they refused to obey the will of the Lord. If they truly knew him, they would want to obey the will of the Lord. Number 3, they took burnt offerings, the meat that's being offered up as sacrifices to God. They would take the meat and consume it before it was thoroughly burnt. That, of course, goes against Levitical law. So even though they were Levitical priests, they were breaking Levitical law because they were hungry, ruled by their stomachs, their appetites. Also mentioned in verse 22, they committed adultery with women who gathered at the door of the tabernacle of worship. And in verse 25, they refused to obey truth and quit sin even when found out. These are very, very serious charges, of which God would hold not only his sons accountable, but Eli accountable as well. We then come to verse 27 of chapter 2, and verses 27 through 36, prophetic declaration over Eli. It says in verse 27, and there came a man unto Eli, and said unto him, thus saith the Lord. And this prophet would make 7 predictions about the house of Eli, which I'll read to you in a second. Okay. The prophet says to Eli, your house and your father's house will be cut off, so there will not be an old man in them forever. That would come to pass in chapter 4. He says, you will see an enemy in my habitation and all the prosperity which God has given Israel. that would come to pass also in chapter 4, when the Philistines would take Shiloh, they would take the tabernacle, and they would take the Ark of the Covenant. Third, those whom I do not cut off from your house shall be worse off, for they shall beg for bread, and from their successors in office. Fourth, this shall be a sign unto you, your 2 sons shall both die in one day, which they did, chapter 4, verse 11. Fifth, I will raise me up a faithful priest that shall do according that to which is in my heart and my mind. 6, I will build him a sure house. And 7, he shall walk before my anointed forever. Now, all these were partially fulfilled during King Solomon's reign, which is covered in 1 Kings 2, 26 through 27. Allow me to read that to you. Okay. That's 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 26 and 27. It says, And to Abiathar the priest the king said, Go to Anathoth, to your own fields, for you are deserving of death, but I will not put you to death at this time, because you carried the ark of the Lord God before my father David, and because you were afflicted every time my father was afflicted. So Solomon removed Abiathar from being the priest of the Lord, that he might fulfill the word of the Lord, which he spoke concerning the house of Eli at Shiloh. That right there is a fulfilling of that prophecy. Okay. Partial fulfillment of that prophecy. The remainder to be filled at the second advent of Christ. All right. Moving on to chapter 3. God begins to use Samuel as his prophetic mouthpiece. God calls to Samuel while he's sleeping. He believes it's Eli. He runs to Eli. Eli says, I didn't call you. So Samuel goes back to bed. Again, God calls Samuel. Samuel comes rushing up to Eli, says, did you call me? And Eli says, no, I did not call you. And then Eli reasons, it must be God. So Eli tells Samuel, if you hear someone calling for you, please say to him, here I am, Lord, your servant. And God does call Samuel a third time. Samuel responds. And starting in verse 11, he says to Samuel, tell Eli this. In verse 11, God says to Samuel, I will do a new thing in Israel at which all ears will tingle. That means when Israel shall hear of it, they shall be astounded, and it shall continue to ring in the ears of all men. This, of course, is referring to the capture of the Ark of the Covenant by the Philistines. Second thing, God says to Samuel in verse 12, in that day I will perform against Eli all things which I have spoken concerning his house. Number 3, God says, when I begin, I will also make an end. This began in chapter 4, verses 1 through 22, with the immediate destruction of the tabernacle, the defeat of Israel, the killing of the priests of the house of Eli, the capture of the ark, and the subjugation of Israel to the Philistines, and it continued with partial fulfillment of certain punishments upon the house of Eli, until it came to an end in the days of Solomon. And the fourth prophecy is, the house of Eli shall not be purged of their iniquity with sacrifice and offering forever. In other words, there's no forgiveness. Ooh, wow. And those are prophecies 810 through 813. And verse 13 gives us the reason why God is doing this. God says, because his son made themselves vile, and he, Eli, restrained them not. So he's not holding, so right there God is saying he's holding the sons guilty, but he's also holding Eli guilty for not being a father and doing something to stop them from being immoral.